So, describe to me some of your memories of the Cold War.
Um, well, I was quite young. I was probably only grade 1 or 2 or 3 when the Cold War was at its peak. But there was always a little bit of fear because there was lots of movies and newsreels about the potential for nuclear warfare. When you're a young child, you don't grasp the enormity of the world being wiped out. But it was a constant threat, and at times it was very scary. There were points of, where people were building bomb shelters. There was lots of shows and books about how to survive nuclear war. I mean, it was really quite a scary time in that regard. Probably it didn't hit home for me until I met a boy from West Germany named Lothar Meyer, who was an exchange student and was my chemistry biology partner at high school. And he lived in a village near the border, maybe 5 miles from the East German, West German border. And he said when you went close, it was a war zone. There were armed troops, cannons, tanks, all up and down the border, barbed wire, mines. It was a scary situation because you could see the opposite troops on the other side waiting to shoot, and your guys are on your side waiting to defend. He said it was even scarier because they often ran drills and war games, and so all of a sudden columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers with men come screaming down the main road of his village on the way to the front. If there was any kind of hint or worry that there was going to be an outbreak, air raid sirens would go off and they would have to evacuate their village immediately because it was so close to the front. So it was a bit surreal for us because we were living in, peaceful Canada so far away from Europe, but listening to Lothar's stories, it was quite scary because he literally lived, at the very edge of where the annihilation would begin, which people at the time theorized would be a border war between East and West Germany.
Can you describe for me, or can you say some of the events that you lived through in the Cold War?
Um, I think probably the fall of the Berlin Wall was pretty important. I was probably in my teens and 20s when that happened. And it was just an enormous relief because it finally meant East and West Germany were going to be reunited, because that was the flashpoint for hostilities, was at the East and West German borders. So now that they were unified, you could say there was a buffer now between Russia and the East and West. So it was also a kind of important event because it meant that both countries were wanting peace, or both sides, and to avoid the nuclear annihilation. Obviously I grew up, there were also many wars that were going on at the time, which you always worried would spill over into a greater conflict. So during my time was the Vietnam War, which also involved communist China, and they had nuclear warheads. So although it was a land war and quite a costly and vicious war, there was always the potential threat that the North Vietnamese or the superpowers would get more deeply involved and end up squaring off on each other over with Vietnam being the starting point. So that was quite a scary time, although it never got to that. There were always border clashes. I remember there was an airliner that got shot down, a Korean airliner, or was it Japanese? Accidentally, so-called accidentally, by Russian.
Yes, I've actually heard about this. Yes.
SSRI, SAM missiles. It had wandered over airspace and they got shot down, and that was a very tense moment between the countries, the West and the East, over that shooting. The Russians had accused it of being a spy plane, You know, and just so you know, I think both sides were probably doing stuff like that. They'd hide surveillance gear in civilian airliners maybe, and then and they accidentally fly over sensitive Russian areas or American areas. So you never really knew who was telling the truth in the media war of finger pointing. Um, those are probably the biggest memories I have of the Cold War, notwithstanding all the troops and the new missile subs. I mean, the Americans were constantly marching out new weapons, as were the Russians. Neutron bomb was one of the big. I remember when that came out, people were afraid because the neutron bomb was actually something that just killed humans but didn't destroy property, and that was a whole new level of killing machine or killing technology. Neutron bombs just threw off a huge pulse of radiation. So the whole idea was it would just irradiate everybody within a certain distance. You wouldn't die immediately, but the radiation dose would be high enough that it would kill the soldier within a matter of days or weeks. But because it was just radiation only, physical structures, bridges, buildings, roads, nothing would be destroyed, as would be in a conventional atomic bomb. So yeah, I remember lots of little bits of the war and how the world was constantly on the edge of, you know, is today the day that people throw the big button and start throwing missiles at each other? Lots of movies too. There are lots of war movies or Cold War movies, or Dr. Strangelove was one of my favorite, which painted an accidental scenario of how World War III started because some crazy general went nutsoid and scrambled B-52s to go bomb the USSR. So yeah, lots of, I mean, it was all consuming at the time.
Thank you very much.
Okay.